Ex Nihilo. Talking to
Dear Alexander Douglas, we're very much looking forward to today's conversation about your latest book, Against Identity. That a philosopher writes a book dealing with the issue of identity in 2025 isn't surprising, in view of all the troops ganging up in the name of identity politics. But what is surprising is the title of your introduction, Identity Kills, leading us to wonder what drives a young philosopher to write a book against identity.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the program. The title of the introduction was partly inspired by Amartya Sen's book on identity, where he says at one point something very striking, which is that identity provides all of these things for people. It provides grounding for their lives and a way to bond, a way to make decisions about what to do. But he says identity can also kill. And he's thinking about his experience as a young boy in Bengal, where he saw very intense sectarian violence playing out in the name not so much of religion as he sees it, but religious identities, which is something a little bit different. It was not just a question of people feeling compelled by their religious beliefs to carry out certain acts, but their anxiety over the identity of themselves and their communities and their nation, which they thought they had to protect at all costs.
so tribalism kills in a way, is it?
Well, I think that's what Amartya Sen is thinking of. But of course, I'm playing off the story that I open with, which is the wonderful story from the end of the last chapter of the Taoist text, the Chuang-Tzu, where there's a character named Hundun. Hundun just means kind of everything wrapped up together. And Hundun is this figure with no face at all. He has a sort of benevolent and welcoming attitude towards these two other emperors. But then, and he's the emperor of the middle, so he's kind of right in between. And then these emperors of these two extremes, the north and the south, get together and put a face onto him by drilling holes into poor Hundun, and then this kills him. And so the book, to an extent, is a meditation on the meaning of that story.
Yeah, I do understand that. For me, one of the great historical mysteries is why an era, because identity politics began in the 1970s, can develop such an obsession with this question. You write very aptly about an obsession with self-branding, the strategic creation of a recognizable identity for promotion and sale. I'm not entirely sure whether we can blame Silicon Valley alone for this, but I think that such a strategic, actually belligerent concept of identity is a real dilemma. But that leads to the conclusion that we bring identity into play precisely because it no longer understands itself. What do you think about that?
I think there's a lot of truth in that. And I agree with you that, the way I try to speak about it in the book is that Silicon Valley has provided us with tools to curate and project identities at a faster rate and to a wider distribution than ever before. But that can't be where the impulse to do this comes from. And as you say, there's a certain type of individualism, a certain type of emphasis on self-creation, self-branding, self-actualization, self-realization that begins much earlier. All of these things that, kind of you associate with Californian institutions that go back before Silicon Valley, but all these things like the Human Development Institute and things with names like this. And the philosophers who I look at in the book all suggest exactly what you say, that the energy, the kind of anxious energy with which identity creation and curation is invested in our society partly comes from the fact that it's a contradictory and doomed enterprise. Because you aspire to have a particular identity, which according to the theorists I look at, is always derived from some kind of model, some model, whether knowingly or not, that you've absorbed from your environment. Perhaps you've cobbled together from different sources, but in any case, it's something external to you, and you're trying to make this your identity, which is a contradiction.
Yeah, in itself, like identity policy as a word even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And so the kind of frenetic pace with which online dynamics propel themselves is driven, the ultimate, the original fuel for this, I think, is the force of this unresolvable contradiction lies at the heart of identity.
Which is what you were getting with the character of the Tao, yes?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, in between. Yeah, so you've studied Spinoza intensively, whose parents come to Holland as Sephardic refugees from Portugal, where he eventually finds himself excommunicated from the Jewish community because of his beliefs and desire for the Enlightenment's universality, essentially making him a poster child of intersectionalism as the refugee with multiple identities. What can Spinoza and his philosophy teach us about identity?
I think Spinoza is a fascinating character for that reason, well, for many reasons, but one of them is all the figures that I look at in my book are sort of outsiders in some way or other. But Spinoza is more than just an outsider. He's the kind of character who threatens people who want to use identity as a kind of political tool because he messes up the categories. He is, as you say, on one hand, a Jewish refugee. That's the situation he's born into. But of course, the community of Jewish refugees in Amsterdam were themselves very conflicted about what exactly it meant to be Jewish. In fact, they were conflicted over what even counted in determining whether somebody was Jewish or not. Was it the beliefs that you practice? Was it your faith? Was it some kind of ethnic, racial connection to a Jewish, to the original children of Israel? All of these things were up for discussion and not resolved, and familiar questions. I'm sure it'll sound familiar to anyone listening today. The sorts of debates and the rancor with which they were invested, and the kind of troubling character that these sorts of questions had for people. And Spinoza is born into this, and then he's excommunicated from the synagogue. He's thrown out. He's placed under cherem, it's called, and doesn't join any other church. So already this was a community whose religious identity was kind of confusing for people around them. Some of them had converted nominally to Christianity, but were still living in the Jewish community. Often they'd been forced to convert, and they weren't really, practicing Christians in any sense. Spinoza is now not part of that community, not part of any Christian community. And this is in an era when the number one thing you would learn about somebody to figure out who they were was their religious affiliation, their confessional identity. Spinoza just doesn't have one. And so this already makes him an immensely troubling figure. And I think it opens his mind to be able to think about these things sort of from the outside in a way that people who are bound up with these things can't see them. And so to some extent, I related to Spinoza because I've had this sort of fairly international background. And you
yourself have a certain background, like with a mother from Macau, is it?
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
And an Australian father. So that's already confusing to people, because,
how was it confusing?
All of these
How was it confusing for you as a little child?
Yeah.
Well, it's confusing for me, I suppose, maybe in the same way that Spinoza might. We can only imagine because we don't have many writings from when he was young. But the story of Hunden speaks to me partly because this action of kind of having a face drilled upon you externally reminds me of the way that you're sort of called upon to identify yourself in terms of these categories that other people have created for you. And when you're, somehow outside of those categories or you fit across them awkwardly, you just don't know what to say to people. You're not sure what you should be presenting. And, the initial effect of this is to drive even further an anxiety that everyone feels, which is the illusion that you have as a teenager is that everyone else has figured out who they are and you're pretending that you have, but you're actually inside, you're deeply confused and tormented. But of course, everyone is in the same boat, they're just not showing it. But I suppose for me, it was even more acutely felt because I was living in these countries where, people had these definite categories that were all set up to work fairly well for people from certain backgrounds, but didn't work particularly well for me, and so I didn't know how to position myself.
There's a certain dialectics at play, which is I found very fascinating. A long time ago, even I read in a book about the migration to America that people left Italy, which is like a belated nation, so to speak, but they arrived in America as Italians, which means like a certain homelessness is kind of intrinsic, even in the idea of identity. I would say like a strong feeling of identity is always at place where you already lost your home. Can you share that?
Yeah, well, I think that's an astonishing thing that happens. You see this in so many immigrant stories that people don't feel like they're from a place until they leave the place.
That's the
moment. A lot of Italian migrants, they become Italian when they come to the United States, and then you have these sort of seventh generation Italian Americans.
Still proud.
Very, very committed to their Italian heritage, more so than any Italian person.
Sure.
So I mean, all of this, I guess, shows how much identity is used as how wrong it is to think of identity as something that's just inborn, that just kind of naturally grows out of you as you just sort of passively interact with your environment. No, it's this thing that has to be taken up and shaped and is constantly being contested between the subject and the others that you're interacting with. It's a constant negotiation. I mean, I suppose another interesting immigrant story is when people, in Australia there were kind of various waves of Lebanese immigration. So the people who migrated to Australia in the 1980s were generally Christians, and then later subsequent migrations tended to be mostly Muslims. But of course, the Muslim Lebanese who came in were kind of already picked out as Lebanese according to a category that had now formed. Australians had already formed this kind of rigid category of what it meant to be Lebanese. And so, all these kinds of experiences lead to the incredible confusion and difficulty of, developing a migrant identity.
When we approach the question of identity, my suspicion is that it's of little help to concern ourselves with the inner psyche. That means the question of the self or the lived experience. The persona is, first and foremost, a mask. And the Greek word for character primarily refers to the stamp used to mint coins. For this reason alone, one should separate the self from identity, which is essentially linked to a social role. That means an external perception. Doesn't much of the mental confusion stem from the fact that this differentiation is not made in our talks?
I think that there's a lot in that. Some psychologists distinguish between self and identity. Roy Baumeister puts it this way. He says that the self is what inhabits and operates the identity. So the self is the kind of driver in the machine, and the identity is the machine. But it's, I think, much more difficult than that, because a driver can step out of a machine and just be a person walking around.
Drive another machine.
Exactly.
Another machine,
Yeah.
But a self can only be identified under a particular identity. The self, the psyche, the ultimate subject is something that can only be accessed under a concept which brings in some degree of identity, whether we like it or not. I drew a little bit from the scholar Kwang-Ming Wu, who notices that in the transfer there are these two different characters for self. In fact, there are lots and lots of characters for self, but there are two that are particularly in play. One of which is Wu, which is a kind of indexical sort of self-reference. Grammatically, it generally only goes in the subject position. And the other is Wo, which ideographically looks like a hand holding an axe. And so this is a kind of self-holding. These are both translated sometimes as self or sometimes translated as I or myself or things like that. But the transfer Kwang-Ming Wu thinks makes a distinction between these two, and everything that is concretely identified as something definite is a kind of war. But your true self, is the way that Kwang-Ming Wu puts it, is not something that can be identified. It's something that slips between these identities. It's always kind of escaping from or not quite being captured by any of these identities. It's a kind of irresolvable remainder.
Well, that makes me think of, there's this German notion I've learned from Martin of image and number. And the image would be this inner self, and the number would be this other part. And there's always kind of a dance in between the two.
Exactly, yeah.
Martin and I both, we belong to the boomer generation, which pushed this idea of self-actualization to extremes. However, when we talk about it, we keep telling ourselves that we're leaving behind something for the next generation that wasn't very successful in this move towards self-actualization. And even though you're a senior lecturer, you belong to a generation that's experienced this freedom as nothing more than self-branding. Tell us, how has this sensitized you to this issue?
That's a wonderful question. And yeah, I think I belong to a generation where our early education was very much shaped by this sort of 1960s, 1970s idea of self-actualization.
Yes.
Mama Cass singing "Make Your Own Kind of Music." This, and so we received what I'm sure was a crude, reduced version of it, which was the notion that each of us just has this self. It's just kind of inside. It hasn't come out yet, because when, especially as a young person, you introspect, you don't find some concrete personality all sketched out for you. You just find a big mess of characteristics and qualities and confusions and choices. But the idea is that somewhere deep inside there is the real self, and you just have to do the right thing to find it, whether it's go on a trip to India and climb a mountain, or and so there's something you can do that can somehow make this thing come out. And you're right, you're absolutely right. I think that what's happened, Hans-Georg Müller and Paul D'Ambrosio have written this book about identity, where they say they associate that idea with the idea of authenticity, the authentic self.
Oh yeah,
deep inside. And they say we've moved from an era of authenticity to an era of profilicity. And a profile is a different kind of self. That's a self that you can sort of build. And so I think you're right. That's what my generation and then subsequent generations have done with this idea of the authentic self is, well, maybe it's not something you can dig down and access, but it's something that you can sort of create. And, technologically, we've become, as I say, better and better endowed with the tools to do this.
Absolutely.
You can build this profile, and a profile is not quite an authentic self. At least this is the way that Muller and D'Ambrosio put it. And it rings true to me. You're to say that somebody, fundamentally is the self that they have curated on their Instagram profile is not quite right. It's and I think that even the person who created that profile wouldn't quite see it that way. So I think that there's a recognition of something quite important there.
What I think is very funny when I look at the word, even I was writing about photography, etc. Authenticity, in the cultural space, appears the very moment when people have photography, etc. And the funny thing is the authentic, the Greek word is the creator, the originator of somebody, but it's also the murderer, which is a very funny, which is a very funny thing. Authenticity is a very dubious thing, but it appears, I would say once again, repeating the story of somebody, a migrant coming to America, leaving Italy, the very moment you leave authenticity behind, because you're not the painter of this image anymore, you're just a photographic unconscious, as Walter Benjamin says, the very moment you find all of a sudden the objectivity, and you find authentic self and so forth, which is for me just a marker of an absence, not of a presence.
Yeah, I completely agree. I wish I could remember what they say, but actually Muller and D'Ambrosio have interesting things to say about how photography changed the our relation to selfhood. Long before social media, all of these technological changes make a big difference. Van Gogh said, if you take a photo of somebody digging, they won't look like they're digging. There's something false about the very accuracy of a photograph. That if you want to paint somebody digging, you have to not be completely true to the image that's presented to you. But somehow this idea of a photograph, which we then associate increasingly with legal identities, the thing you carry around in your passport. Surely that changes the way that we think about ourselves. And to a large extent, we're still living with the legacy of that as well.
The absurd consequences of identity politics can be clearly seen in the Self-Determination Act that has been introduced in Germany. My argument against it is as follows. My father had a pronounced aristocratic streak and went to great lengths to trace his family lineage back to Charlemagne, which was displayed as a gigantic family tree in our apartment with my name at the top and Charlemagne at the bottom. If I now wanted to claim with some justification that royal blood flows in my veins, I could say my pronoun is his or her majesty, gender neutral, and I could sue anyone in Germany who does not comply and refers to my bourgeois background for damages. What we have here in the name of identity is that anyone can be placed in the position of a central bank and can compel others with the force of law to accept their identity currency. This is actually the prelude to a symbolic civil war. But this act of violence does not stem from self-confidence, but from an edict of tolerance driven to excess, maybe even impotence. What do you think of this?
Well, that's a big tangle. I mean, in respect to the law itself, I've heard differing accounts of this. I've heard some legal experts say you could only successfully sue somebody under this law if you could prove that they'd somehow released private information about you. So with respect,
my bourgeois. If I declare myself his or her majesty, etc., this very moment I could sue you. If you say Mr. Burkhardt, you have this bourgeois background.
Right, I see. Yeah, I mean, legal identities are a funny thing because, of course, it's conceivable that we could live in a world where one was legally compelled to address you in that way. If some kind of revived ultra party took over and tried to reinstate aristocratic rules of address, sumptuary laws, all of these kinds of things, then you could make it illegal for me not to refer to you in a particular way. But the question is, what do these things mean? People use the law as battlegrounds for figuring out things about their own identity. But like anything where somebody is trying to find some external tool to ultimately settle the question of who they truly are, I'm not talking about particular legal rights, that belong to people in terms of belong to various categories. Of course, there are legal recognitions of that. But, legal identities are so superficial. I am legally Portuguese because my mother was born in what was at the time a Portuguese colony. It's so meaningless in terms of what it says about me, except that, it gives me certain legal privileges. But of course, in a certain sense, in a particular context, I can demand that a particular person treats me as Portuguese. If I walk up to vote in a Portuguese election, or I try to cross a border or something, then legally that person has to take me as Portuguese. But of course, does this tell me anything about myself? It might be that, and of course, colonial populations did this. Some people were so attached to a particular sense of identity that they would spend their whole lives pursuing this legal status. They would do everything that they could to get Portuguese citizenship, not Macau citizenship, but Portuguese citizenship. And what would they find? Had they now resolved the question of who they were? Did they now have the kind of resolution?
The argument that I had was a little bit different. Like I was wondering just about the moment of this self-empowerment, identity as a self-empowerment measure, like bringing myself into a position which was in the 60s, 70s, would have been unthinkable. Me emitting something like a fiat currency, my identity, and wanting you to respect that, and even treating you and so if you do not respect it, I'm gonna sue you. And which is now the very situation, the legal situation in Germany, which is weird because all of a sudden you say, if anybody comes with this story of mine, that everybody has with 6 links, a link to Charlemagne, etc. Everybody could declare himself king, fiat currency, which is a weird moment because there would be a certain benevolence in society would kind of be omitted all of a sudden. Treating the other in a dialogical way. But not me having some privilege according to you.
And pushing it even a little further, I did a lot of DNA studies looking at my background, and I too am related to Charlemagne. But I've also got 0.1% of Nigerian, 0.1% of Asian, and Native American. So I could essentially take this currency and I could change it year to year. I mean, it becomes a very strange sort of thing, trying to legally identify this currency.
And of course, you don't determine the value of the currency, to use this very evocative metaphor. My mother was telling me she was in Hong Kong not long ago, and she said, now it's really high status to be Eurasian, to be mixed race in Hong Kong. And of course, when she was growing up, that was the worst possible thing to be. It was worse than either of the categories. Yes. So, yes, you can, to some extent, maybe demand recognition as belonging to a particular category, but you can't demand how people are going to value the category that you've placed yourself in. But as far as, self-determination goes, I guess you have to step back and think, well, the extremes to which these bits of legislation go have their origins, of course, in how extreme people's responses to questions of identity already were. So if you think about the trans community, it's the fact that people around the world continue to be killed for, violently murdered for not fitting into particular gender categories. They may not have even been aware of that. They were violating particular norms, or in a place like Germany, I guess that, the early experience of kind of being asked, why can't you be this? Why can't you be this particular thing? The sort of psychological effect that has on people, the dynamic is already so fraught that I think it's what you should expect, that when people come to the point of trying to make legislation about this, their views have already been invested with so much pain and so much trauma, and so much fear that
I'm not really sure if we should be a little bit more careful with the concepts here. For example, like, because when I sat in front of a computer game, my son, like, he forced me, like, to play any imaginable computer game with him. So I'm kind of maybe like brought up a little bit more like you, sitting in front of something like Age of Empires and the like, etc. So, but the moment I sat there and like I saw, okay, I can equip my avatar with any like superpower imaginable, etc. The idea that there was like a deep leaning for being trans, like transition my natural scarcity, etc., was evident. So I got it like right away. Okay, like identity is like a big promise, like a big playful, ludic promise, and like to be somebody else. This is why I like started talking as a theoretic, not to be an individual anymore, but to be a individual, like being somebody who might choose a lot of, which is like a totally different like idea of identity, is it? Because it's passing behind. It has nothing to do with all these old tribal concepts of the in-group, out-group, and the like. It's all of a sudden, it's a playground for you to develop something new.
Yeah. And, I mean, maybe that is the way that identity will go. Again, there's this sort of idea of prophilic identity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Identity is something that you can just sort of play with. And is that a positive or a negative thing? Well, the important point, I think, I believe that there's a certain universal human struggle. It's probably an unfashionable idea in the circles I move in. But I guess what I wanted to show with the book, part of the reason I ranged across centuries and continents the way that I did was I think that there's something universal in the human experience, which is because of the kinds of social animals we are, we very early on develop this longing to kind of have the question of who we are definitely settled. As Augustine says early in the Confessions, I have become an enigma to myself, or I've become a question to myself. And there's something in us that wants to solve that. And these sorts of playful devices for self-presentation, for, kind of gamifying identity by trying on different guises and messing around with different categories are not going to resolve that. They're not,
okay, you see the existential thing. Okay, got it.
That longing, yeah. Yeah. And they may not, that might not be what they're for, It might not be that building an Instagram profile is supposed to ultimately resolve the question of who you are. But I think that because we all have this longing, I think that these things can very easily become, anything can become, an occupation can become like this, a political view can become like this.
Sure.
Anything can sort of be seized upon as the pathway to salvation from this enigma of, longing for identity. There's this enigma of identity that drives us. That's where I think the danger lies.
Besides reading Spinoza, you've deeply explored René Girard, who, after starting with Dostoevsky's Underground Man and Mimetic Desire, then he investigated the connection between violence and religion. Mimetic Desire shows that true genius is the exception, and most people are just copycats. This isn't a problem as long as the copyist remains an unreachable goal, like Christ. But then it gets complicated when the person I'm copying is in my neighborhood, because then, as Girard explains, admiration can quickly turn into envy or hatred. Considering Joseph Boy's statement that everyone is an artist from Girard's perspective, we find ourselves facing a very tough dilemma, even a form of social resentment, which, as Girard tells us, is the moment we begin searching for the scapegoat. Isn't this the situation we're currently in?
Yes, I believe so. There are many paradoxes in Girard, but one of the paradoxes is the paradox of the master and the disciple. That the master wants to have disciples. I see this in academia, the way paradox plays out, right? Yeah, I mean, people want to be deep down, most academics, there's at least a trace of them of this ambition that they don't want to be, say, a Heideggerian. They want to be like Heidegger. They want to have, Douglassians of their own, or disciples of their own. But this is a terrible paradox, because a system in which everyone is a master and nobody is a disciple is logically incoherent. If everybody is just the originator of the school and nobody wants to be a follower, then nobody is satisfied. And you also have the paradox that a disciple who emulates the master too perfectly becomes a rival. An example I was just reading about was, when the European colonial powers were in Asia and they were encouraging these Asian countries to modernize, and then Japan modernized, and then it modernized too well, and then it became a rival to the Western powers, which is, not at all what they intended. But then what did they intend? If a country modernizes, of course it's going to modernize its military and it's going to become a military power. So there's something always, I think, in this relationship between master and disciple, which is an unresolved paradox and only remains in place because we avert our eyes from the paradoxical character. Now, for Girard, this relates to scapegoating, because he thinks in this way rivalries just proliferate. They're inevitably going to proliferate through a society. It doesn't matter what the economic order of the society is. It will happen in different ways depending on what sort of economic order you have. But for Girard, this is a dynamic that's too intrinsic to the nature of the relationship to be a mere matter of material circumstances. And so it will proliferate through any society. Societies' rivalries will grow in intensity and spread through any society. And traditionally, what Girard calls archaic societies, resolved this by finding a way to concentrate all their rivalries onto a single scapegoat victim. And I think that, Girard is very strongly of the view that once the scapegoat mechanism is revealed, this doesn't work anymore. But I think as he got older, he started to realize that, it doesn't work as perfectly as it did in archaic societies, but it works well enough to always be there as a political tool. It's not as if politicians, for example, don't benefit by scapegoating occasionally. And, I think that this is an idea that can unlock certain paradoxes that lie in the way of what seem to be political issues that should have been resolved a long time ago. So, you can think of as many examples as you like, but even in my own lifetime, I think, I lived in the United States when I was younger, and I think there was a sense in the 1990s that racial issues were going to be on the way to being resolved in the United States, that, the civil rights movement was, a few decades ago, but it takes a bit of time for these things to really get going. And, we should now, by now, have been, it's just a thing of the past, something you read about in history books. And yet somehow the machine just gets stuck. Why? I think that, sorry, please.
No, go ahead.
Keep going, yes.
There's something that I remember reading in James Baldwin in The Fire Next Time, I think, where, he's responding to critics who say that it's utopian to expect that white people in the United States will ever sort of love the African American. And then he says something like, we're not asking you to love us, we're asking you to love each other so you no longer have the need for us. And what he means is that the need for us as this character, as this malevolent sort of explanation for everything that's going wrong with the country.
We've got a very strange, I mean, particularly in Germany, we've got this weird a moment that when the Jewry kind of assimilated totally in society and got kind of invisible, etc. Somebody like Hitler came up and this is a reported quote of him by Hermann Rauschning, and Hitler said, "If the Jew did not exist, we had to invent him." Take that. All of a sudden, you need this beloved enemy to give you the position of the identity, which is a bizarre situation. All of a sudden, your German identity, so we are not this capitalist, Zionist, whatever, mass media, proliferating guys. We are the true Germans, etc. So it's an identity turning into an invention of an enemy, which is even weirder. All of a sudden you could say for these days, you need something like a metaphysical Nazi to have an identity, is it? When I look around at the media, etc., it looks totally bizarre because I see a lot of people with invented enemies.
Yeah, and I think that's very much Girard's point. I mean, it goes sort of cyclically. For Girard, the reason why we develop this, well, the reason why this kind of longing for identity becomes so existentially profound for us early on is because we grew up in societies, as his understanding, that were practicing scapegoating for, well into our
forever
prehistory. Yeah. And so how do you avoid being a scapegoat? Well, you have to make sure that you're not singled out as the person who is different in some relevant way, who's perceived as being an internal threat. Because societies that are policing for internal threats, they're not looking for somebody who goes around acting dangerous. Because if you're smart about being dangerous, you're not going to act dangerous, right? You're going to, to some extent, blend in. And so we have these very hyper-vigilant societies who are looking for anything out of the ordinary. I think of the terrorism ads on public transport. They say, look out for anything out of the ordinary. You're not looking for somebody who's carrying, a big bag that says bomb on it. You're just looking for anything that looks not like what I was expecting to see. And so we internalize this. We think, okay, I'd better define what I am very clearly and present it very explicitly and hope that the identity that I'm projecting is going to be accepted. So something in this is wired very culturally deep into us. And then you have, on the other hand, this phenomenon that people then form these communities but are constantly under threat from each other, from rivalries.
Sure.
Yes.
Of course, Hitler was entering a country where Germans were a threat to other Germans. Not just foreign enemies, not just these categories that he was picking out of people who were supposedly internal enemies. Just people were at odds with each other. That's what happens when you have a very fraught economic situation and all the other things. Girard's understanding is that the reason why there had to be so many victims is because scapegoating doesn't work very well when it's possible for somebody to recognize it for what it is. So Girard sees archaic societies as people come together, they expel a scapegoat victim, suddenly peace descends upon the society, and they don't really know why, but they know that it has something to do with this victim. So often the victim then ends up being revered, after their death or expulsion. That the victim somehow gave their life to reharmonize this community. But Girard thinks once you have the Christian story, which exposes this for what it really is, which is, there is, as he understands the Christian story, there is
the forgetting of the victim, because somebody declares himself the victim for everybody, like universality.
Right.
That's right. Yeah,
blood is shed. Yes.
But of course, we live with the legacy of both these things. On one hand, we have people who are constantly trying to sort of relaunch the scapegoat mechanism to, which is how Girard saw the Nazi project, as a fairly explicit attempt to just deploy this mechanism, as you say, as a kind of tool of unity, which didn't work particularly well. But, you always have that. And at the same time, we have the sort of worship of victims, playing out in the same way. And Girard recognizes that both of these dynamics can become co-opted in dangerous ways. For the most part, he sees it as a positive thing that we, as part of the legacy of Christianity, want to be on the side of the victim. But Girard recognizes that that too can be used. I mean, and to some extent, you have that even in the Nazi example, right? There's an awful lot of victimage rhetoric in Hitler's speeches as well.
Sure.
Germans as the victims. So it's a strange thing, you have this kind of attempt to be both the victimizer and the victim at the same time.
I understand Girard very well, like being more Christian than the Christians and being more enlightened than the Enlightenment. That's a kind of wonderful phrase that he got in the end, etc. When identity becomes an act of self-determination, a dilemma dating back to Aristotle returns. We already touched on the fact that identity can easily be confused with a social role that is actually a currency. And in this sense, it is used in the Victim Olympics as a damaged identity that demands compensation. Aristotle says that the coin is called nomisma because any value can be stamped on it, and thus introduces the idea of the arbitrary sign to the word. On the other hand, he claims that because the coin is a sterile form of wealth, it cannot generate interest. That means added value. That would be unnatural. Herein lies the paradox. On the one hand, we speak of the arbitrary sign, that means total freedom, while on the other hand, we invoke nature by referring to the unnatural. This brings us to a point that Aristotle overlooks. The coin was face value historically, and that's something Girard does not take into account, is a byproduct of the alphabet. That means a symbolic order. And the concept of identity that we have only makes sense if we can say A equals A equals A. This raises the question, could it be that the problem of identity politics only arises because identity, that means the logic of writing of the alphabet, becomes questionable in the digital age?
That's very interesting. Girard, of course, says something about the symbolic order, which is that, he says there's an alternative to Levi-Strauss's way of thinking about a symbolic order is always based on oppositions, which is a symbolic order can be based on homogeneity if there's an excluded element.
The Pharmakon.
The Pharmakon, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So he says, you could imagine a kind of symbolic order beginning with something like the bean in the Epiphany cake, the kind of one that's now distinguished from all the others. And that might be going in the direction of what you're suggesting. But more fundamentally than that, I think you're absolutely right that identity as a relation can sort of be concretized. This is where you have something like the fetishization of money in Aristotle. So I wish I'd thought of the analogy that you're making before I wrote the book, because Spinoza actually talks about this with money. He says that, money is a very useful sort of measure of comparative value, and it can become pathological when somebody because they associate the idea of money with everything that has value, they come to think that the money itself is the value, So here's one of the earliest sort of theories of money fetishism. And you can think of identity fetishism in the same way that people say things like, what's very important is that I am me. I am who I am. And you say, well, who is that? Often people don't have an answer to that. So no, what's important is not the thing that bears this relation of identity to itself. Somehow the relation has almost become confused with the thing that's supposed to be the single relatum. In fact, I was just reading this morning a speech by J.D. Vance where he starts off warning about the loss of American identity. And then he turns to the question, he says, so we need to answer the question of what it means to be an American. Well, I read this speech, I don't know why I did this, but I read it a couple of times, and I could not tell you what the answer to that question is meant to be. What's important to him is that an American is an American and not something else. But what it is, he negates a lot of answers. He says, well, it can't be just this, and it can't be just that, and it can't mean just that. But what? So somehow,
the people, when they talk about identity, they forget. If they ask, who am I, etc., they forget, like, I, me, and myself on the dopamine bus. Meaning, like, this omnibus, like, everybody's kind of like enchanted with, etc., which is, once again, like, this homogeneity also brought into being, etc., with money, etc. The funny thing about, like, Girard, like, what he does not get, so he does not get, for example, at the very moment that you've got, like, a central bank, and that you've got, like, a printed money, etc., then all of a sudden you do not need the singling out of the Pharmakon, because everybody is paying his tribute, his, like, tribute money to the community, etc. So that's why, like, we do, like, in the Occidental opening, like, the Pharmakon could, like, be superseded by Christ, because people did not have to look for a Pharmakon anymore, for, like, the singling out somebody, and that Girard never got that. Which is, like, a bad thing, like, because all of a sudden, like, it's this linkage between, like, identity and money. That's something missing in his philosophy, I would say.
That's interesting, but why wouldn't it go the other way? I think Girard would just say that the institution of money, like everything else, is a product of the original, what he calls colonization.
I give you a little thing, but because we're living in the time of Spinoza, 17th century, etc. There was, like, a time of the big enemy of money, etc. Big problem. Then all of a sudden, like, the Bank of England comes, and, like, Bernard de Mondeville, like, is able to say a sentence like that: a private vice turned into a public benefit. Which is, like, a totally different thing. All of a sudden, like, egotism gets kind of tamed, etc. in our capitalist societies. Like, two egotistical capitalists could compete with each other, and they aren't really needing somebody, like, being the scapegoat here, because they could say, I want to build like, a better product. And what we have, like, today with leaving the central banking, with Bretton Woods behind us, etc., we've got all of a sudden, like, a society which is very unstable, and, like, we're financially unstable, and all of a sudden we need scapegoats.
Yes. Okay. I know. I see what you mean. I think there is a lot in that. I do talk a little bit about this change, which is very relevant for Spinoza's time. That this is the beginning of the change from seeing the social organism as something from which individuals emerge, to seeing society as something that's the aggregate effect of a bunch of individuals doing. It's a very, very profound change, which of course affects how people view identity. But I think you're right. I mean, Girard, so some Girardians, like Jean-Pierre Dupuy and Paul Dumichel, have tried to reconcile his view with the significance of the development of early capitalism, and especially money capitalism that you're describing. And I agree that there's something tricky there. I mean, one thing that's important, Girard doesn't really mention until later, and it comes up in a couple of interviews, that mimetic rivalries, which originally generated the scapegoat mechanism, have to some extent been tamed through just the endless proliferation of commodities. So if
sure,
you don't have desires converging on a single object if you can just make sure that there are so many objects and
floating,
circulating so quickly that you just don't have time for any rivalry to develop. The object goes too quickly from the shelf to the bin, says Girard, for any rivalry to form over it. But of course, as you say, I mean, and money, I think, is very important in this respect. Alexandre Matheron talks about this specifically. He said, money is important because it's infinitely reproducible with central banking, etc. And so, well, you can always just give 50 people a financial claim on the same resources, and then you don't even need to proliferate the resources, as long as nobody digs too deep into the underlying source of the financial assets. But when people do start to dig into them and they realize that there are a great deal more assets than there are underlying resources to give them value, then of course you have these problems. And as far as the proliferation of resources goes, we run into the ecological constraints of our planet. And so it's a very interesting question, which of course I don't know the answer to, what we should expect to see on a Girardian theory the next few decades produce. But certainly it seems like a return to
Scapegoat, yeah.
Scapegoating is
visible.
Yeah, I'm Carl Schmitt. It's strange how people are using Carl Schmitt to justify where we are.
Yeah, and I think that Carl Schmitt is just a kind of distracting way of talking about scapegoating. You know, this friend-enemy distinction is really
absolutely
a scapegoat distinction.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, looking around the world, we'd have to say that in an attention economy, everyone is forced to commodify their identity. But what exactly does this self-branding look like? In practical terms, doesn't it boil down to cultivating your internet avatar, your profile, as you were saying, or what we boomers would call an image? And because the avatar can work for 24/7, it provides a kind of identity machine. Martin and I joke a lot about Kim Kardashian's butt. It works 24/7 for her.
As a piggy bank.
As a piggy bank. Even though she's not, it's generating money. So if this is possible, it is becoming even possible for a purely fictional avatar generated by artificial intelligence to become an influencer. Or as Der Spiegel critically wrote about such a construct, it doesn't eat, it doesn't sleep, but it still earns money. Once people began undergoing cosmetic surgery to look like their social media avatars, their profiles, their identity became obsolete or becomes obsolete, making us wonder, despite this, why do so many people vehemently insist on their identity?
I think that's profound. The danger of associating the human with identity, I think, is precisely this, that we are still emerging from this era, you know, where this kind of Kantian notion of personhood, that being attached to having some kind of definite thing that you are, some kind of definite identity. I'm not saying that that's how Kant sees it, but that somehow seems to be how that idea eventually proliferated through broader culture. And after all, a Kantian noumenon is something stable. You know, it may not be something that we can ever access, but there's something kind of stable and authentic here. And what we seem to have developed is a world where people assert their humanity by building a very detailed profile. And as you say, you know, these profiles are kind of artificially constructed, but then often the artificially constructed profile can be built into the very person.
Sure.
It's not just an online thing, you know, the avatar comes offline.
Real.
Human being.
Yes.
Yeah, you know, the thing of people getting cosmetic surgery to look more like their filtered photographs. And I have to say, just incidentally, I'm incredibly impressed by the ability that people have to do this. As soon as you meet somebody in person, you see through the facade, you know, when they don't have all the cameras and everything, you know, they're not going to, sometimes people can, just, they don't need the cameras. They don't need the filters. They don't need any of it. They have somehow built it in directly into their skin.
A beautify filter.
And so the notion of authenticity, I think, is therefore just out the window. You know, the idea that, well, you know, we can always dig down to the authentic level. That's gone. But you're right that I think that these AI tools show us something extremely interesting, which is that mimesis and identity are very closely bound together, it turns out. I mean, I would say that because that's the thesis of the book. But I think what greater proof could you have from that than seeing that a tool that does nothing but imitate, that is effectively, as people say, a stochastic parrot, all it does is minimize a loss function between what it's doing and some models that it's being fed as training data, can develop these extremely detailed, extremely plausible, authentic avatars.
It's seductive.
Very seductive.
Avatars. Yeah. And so, I suppose I wasn't thinking about this consciously when I wrote the book, but I guess one hope that I have for this intervention is that we can start to remember that there's the other part of being human, which is precisely failing to effectively conform to an identity, which is
to do better.
Not being quite what you are. One thing that does distinguish us from AI, I think, so far, is that we can often be quite bad at being ourselves.
I always quote like Samuel Beckett in this respect, because like he said, like this wonderful, I tried, I failed, I tried again, I failed better. The art of failure is really something which is like, I would say, like I would like you like start all my lectures with the forget yourself, like forget identity, be individual, start learning like to fail. Which is like to fail better. And like I would say, like identity seems to me a little bit like a Don Quixotean endeavor, etc. Like fighting the giants of the past to be like a hero of the past, but it's not really like conforming with like an everyday something that you could solve like these days. You quote the Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno very nicely at the end of your book. Identity, which is death, is the god of the intellect. I would say that the problem of identity actually has to do with the shame of philosophers who do not really think about writing and the alphabet. And for this very reason, A equals A, have instituted something like metaphysics. When Heidegger read the cyberneticist Gotthard Günther, he wrote an essay entitled The End of Philosophy and the Giving Up of Thinking, or the task of thinking. Aufgabe is like the very same thing. This can be summed up very simple in a formula. If you take George Boole's laws of thought, you will find that the 0 and the 1, the two royal numbers of mathematics, what they have in common boils down to a formula. X equals x to the n. And that means I'm someone else. I'm a population. I am superfluous. Isn't this the reason why we must oppose identity? That the task of our future self should be to become ever more intelligent, ever more smart, like upgrading instead of like downgrading to Don Quixotean identity?
Absolutely. So first, let me say something about failure, because I think that's a very important point. One of the main, I think the recurring criticism, or at least challenge, that I've had about this book so far is people saying, well, what are we supposed to do? If we really take on this Taoist idea and we detach ourselves from any notion of fixed identity, we allow ourselves to just be influenced by others around us, to kind of stop trying to fix ourselves onto a model of self and pursue that, how are we supposed to act in the world? And so I realized that I think I need to develop much more another Taoist idea, which is the idea of of non-acting, because the answer is there's something wrong with the question. If you're thinking about acting, how am I supposed to act in the world? And what you mean by act in the world is fix some intention and then doggedly pursue that intention and try to block out external influences which will knock me off that course. Then, of course, the recommendation is not going to be of any use to you. But we also need to learn to think in a different way about agency, in a different way about freedom, where freedom and agency are constituted by exposure to things that surprise us. And so failure comes to mean a very crucial thing, as you say.
Sure.
And I think that can lead me into the answer to your other question about x equals x to the n, because you can think about it in terms of geopolitics. You have these powerful nations now which are becoming increasingly paranoid about losing their position, their status on the world stage. And their response is, well, we're going to close ourselves off then. We're going to retain our power by closing ourselves off. And so what they're thinking about their power as is something that's somehow inside of them.
Yeah, isolation is
something that they're drawing from being integrated into a larger whole. So, the fact that people are attracted to this at the geopolitical level suggests to me that consciously or otherwise we still think like this as people as well. we still think that our identity, which comes from within us, is the source of our power and our success. We don't accept. And even when people say that they're open to other influences, they want to be selective about which influences they get. You know, people say,
yes.
you know, I'm always happy to listen to other liberals, Democrats. I'm always happy to listen to other Muslims. You know, it's well, you know, so you've decided what you want to be influenced by before you allow the influence to get to you. But you know, genuinely opening yourselves out to
it's a good idea.
To the other means not prejudging what you might end up with. So I guess what stands in the way of this recognition that you're suggesting is something like what was his name? The psychiatrist R.D. Laing called diaphobia, you know, which is a fear of dialogue or a fear of any kind of dialogic relationship.
Being interpenetrated,
because of the risk that you might come out from different, that you might come out, you know, having given up some of your cherished starting points. So I guess, you know, and again, I think that our online tools have equipped us to close ourselves off from the world. You know, this was originally celebrated as something that was going to make everybody interconnected and create an open world. But instead, what you can do is switch somebody off as soon as you don't like the direction the conversation is going, and just go to a different conversation which is going. And so you have the illusion that you're having this ongoing dialogue, when what in fact you're doing is just following a track that you set for yourself from the very beginning.
If you were a science fiction author imagining a society that's left the phantasms of identity behind, what would it look like?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. And it occurs to me that I can't even think of an example of a science fiction novel that tries to represent this. I mean, one thing that came to mind was Ursula Le Guin, who was very interested in Taoism, had this novel called The Lathe of Heaven. And a lathe of heaven is this image from the Lao Tzu. The premise is that there's a character who can sort of move between these worlds, and sort of has these dreams that change things that happened in the past, and therefore reality takes on a completely different character. Now, there's a romance between this main character and a woman who only appears in some of the worlds. And it's explained that the reason she doesn't appear in some of the worlds is because her ethnicity, her racial identity is definitive of who she is, definitive at least of the character that he meets. Whereas he is such a mellifluous character who's kind of not defined by anything, that he can just exist in any of these realities. He can kind of go between all of them. But what's interesting is that she can only explain the idea of what it would mean to detach from an identity by having characters who don't manage to, at least in his mind. I mean, presumably, you know, there might be versions of this woman who he just doesn't recognize as this woman because he has associated her with this particular characteristic. But how could you imagine a world? I guess I would, to some extent, cop out of the question by saying that if it were imaginable, then it wouldn't be a world in which, because, you know, in order to imagine it, I would still have to imagine how people are going to be. And if I'm imagining how people are going to be, I'm already condemning them to retaining certain identity features.
So identity is inevitable.
Well, I do think that as well. And that gives me a chance to say something important about the title, because the title obviously, you know, is this provocation. And it sounds incredibly polemical to say against identity. You know, people take it in
No, I like it very much, like totally positive about it, not any criticism.
Well, good. But what I wanted to say about it was that another way to interpret it is in a directional sense, because, so you could also think about it in this directional sense, that there are all these forces that pull us in towards identity. They can get us stuck and fixated and attached to identity. the question is, what are the forces that draw us away in the opposite direction? How can we, when we need to retreat from identity? It seems utopian to suggest that we can ever fully overcome this tendency.